Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Transport Division of Saice's third webinar in a series of how do we consider all the new changes in behavior of people and how we can incorporate this into our planning. We have this new opportunity of considering all transport matters afresh. So today we have two speakers, Ronald King and Lisa Seftel. I will introduce them just now. The objective of today's discussion is really, as per the invitation, is that we discuss a little bit the behavioral changes and what the effect of that is on the economy and the impact of that on transport in the much broader context. Then importantly, we are concerned as individuals, and I think as transport professionals, we need to always consider the poor and the disadvantaged people and how they need to commute. They don't have those choices that some of us have, and we need to see what we can do. And how do we address those needs of the poor and disadvantaged? And then out of all of these, we need to consider the potential opportunities and how we can take this forward. How can we influence government or our clients in terms of thinking much broader? So for today, we have the two speakers as indicated. Ronald King, he is first going to make a presentation, and thereafter Lisa Seftel. So our program is the two presenters that I've just introduced. Just before the presentation, I'll give a bit more detail concerning them and why they are really the right people to speak to you today. Thereafter, we will have a question and answer session. As we indicate there, it's based on the questions that we received from you during the registration. And now you can imagine that if you have 300 people registering, you may have 600 questions. So it's impossible. So we've concluded that or consolidated that in a number of questions, which has been forwarded to the two presenters, and they will have an opportunity to respond to those. Then at the end, if time permits, we will allow questions from the floor. I have one of my committee members, Madeleine Engelbrecht, and well, not one, I think Victor is also somewhere there, and he's going to assist filtering through that, and if time permits, we will allow that. Then we will have a few closing positive remarks, because you can imagine if we talk about the economy and if we talk about taxis, then people are not in a happy mood, and I think we need to also change our behavior personally in terms of that. And then at the end, we will have closing and introduce our next event from there. Therefore, without any further discussion from my side, really, thank you very much. You see the timelines. If there's, for whatever reason, you need to respond to a call of the minister or a very important client, please do so, except Ronald and Lisa. While they are presenting, they may not take the call of the president or the minister of finance. So with those, I'm going to move forward and introduce you to Ronald. Advocate Ronald King. He is the head of public policy and regulatory affairs at PSG Consult. Now, immediately one can say, well, if he deals with all the regulations, well, that is quite a topic that we've heard over the last four and a half months, new regulations. But in the finance environment, they were quite privileged to be able to get back to offices at the very early stage of lockdown. But that also had a lot of impact on terms of what they are doing. He's also the director of the Financial Intermediaries Association of South Africa. And you can see all of these matters. He's chair of a regulatory committee, and he holds degrees in the BCom at Stellenbosch. I won't keep that against him, but probably supports the right rugby team. Then he studied in the Free State. He was moving north like the Voortrekkers, realizing that you can't just always stay there. And ultimately at UNISA, he did his LLB and the LLM. Without further ado, Ronald, just the last sentence. Seeing your exposure to the economy and what you need to do as futuristic policy regulatory person at PSG, it's like a chess game, and he's quite involved in chess as well. So from that, maybe the end game is more important than how you start. You may fix it in between. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Ronald, and you can move on, take over the slide. Thank you very much, and welcome, Ronald.
Thank you, Friedrich. Of course, I'm supporting the right team. I'm a Stormer supporter through and through. I have started at Stellenbosch. I also ended there. My last master's was Masters in Future Studies, also at the University of Stellenbosch. So I have quite a large presentation that I'm running through, 44 slides. I'm going to jump through many of them. I have included them in the back for reference for you if you want to refer back to them later yourself. So I'm going to quickly chat about the pandemic. There's so much fake news out there, just putting things in perspective. Then the impact on the South African economy. Talking a little bit about social behavioral changes, and then I'm going to move completely out of my comfort zone and into yours, the whole transport area. Fortunately enough, you've got Ms. Seftel after me, who is quite knowledgeable on that and will correct all the mistakes that I make in the fourth section. And then the discussion points maybe afterwards, just for you. So let's chat about the pandemic, and the numbers across the world is actually pretty grim at this stage. We've just topped the 20.5 million mark in the world. Nearly 750,000 people has passed away from this pandemic. 13.5 million have recovered. In South Africa, we currently have 568 cases, of which 432 has recovered. So our recovery rate is significantly higher than the rest of the world. And unfortunately, the official death for COVID at this stage in South Africa stands at 11,000. But I'm going to come back to that number in a short while. Now, there's a lot of people that, of course, say that this was not predicted at all. Now, I've been in future studies and doing these talks about the future since 2005. And my first presentation that I did was, are you ready for 2020? That was 15 years ago. And I mean, it felt as if 2020 was miles away. And my one slide said, how will your health look in 2020? I was concerned about chocolate, as I always am. But I was also, there was 5 points that I thought that would be the main topics of discussion during 2020. And you will see that the one that I highlighted there at the end was pandemic. So in 2005, my prediction was that we would be talking about pandemics in 2020. If I just put some money on that, I would have been able to retire. Now, how is South Africa stacking up against the rest of the world? We look pretty bad. We're currently in 5th position. Now, I don't think we're going to catch up to any of the other 4, but at 563 total cases, we have the dubious honor of being the 5th most affected country in the world. So there's 2 things about the pandemic that I just quickly want to touch on. The first one is R0, which is a really quite a misunderstood concept. It's the basic reproductive number. So the number of people the average infected person will directly infect. Now, if you start looking at measures that you're taking, then they start talking about RE, not R0 anymore. But the problem with the infection of the COVID-19 virus is that different to most other viruses that we've had to this date, you can be infectious before you show any symptoms, and that has been a significant problem. It's also unclear what the actual reproduction number of this virus is, because of the fact that so many of the people that are infected is asymptomatic. And what people tend to forget is that asymptomatic doesn't mean that you are not infecting other people. And this is one of the interesting things that's just come out of South Korea with children. Up to the age of 19, the chances of you actually getting seriously ill, or even showing any symptoms, mild symptoms for that matter, is very, very low. But that is not the same with regards to your level of contagion. The research in South Korea now shows that below the age of 10, you do not really infect other people, but children between the age of 10 and 18 are more infectious than adults. So schools is a problem. Schools will, especially your high schools, the kids will not get sick, but it will definitely be hotspots across the country. And that's more than likely the reason why it had to be closed for a second time. There's just some information there about what it is. Now, the other important thing is that the lower the reproduction number, or the higher the reproduction number, apologies, the higher your herd immunity needs to be. Now, herd immunity is how many people in the society needs to be infected before the virus will burn itself out. On a 2, it's about 50–55% of the population. But if the reproduction number moves up to 5, and it would seem that there's a new strain now coming out at about a 5 reproduction number, then your herd immunity starts going up to 86%. That is important because that impacts how long this virus is going to be with us. Now, interestingly, in South Africa, it would seem that we have had a massive peak very quickly, very short, and we are dropping off the other side. And that is why there's so much talk of we moving to level 2 after an announcement by the president. But I've just heard a joke again. When he starts saying, my fellow South Africans, you must know that it's going to be with immediate effect. So probably a good thing, all of you, to go and buy your takeaways on Saturday, just to make sure that it isn't locked out. The second graph there, however, is the most important one. That is the graph of weekly deaths in South Africa from all causes. You've got the yellow line there, and you've got your standard deviation on both sides of it. If you look at that number, we have excess deaths until the 28th of July of 28,000 people compared to 10,000 people that's passed away. So there's 3 times more people suddenly dying from unknown causes than last year and the year before that. And that's showing us that we do not record all the COVID deaths in South Africa, and that the death rate in South Africa is probably 3 times higher than we are currently indicating. And for that reason, Dr. Mkhize, the Minister of Health, has now requested that all people passing away suddenly must have a blood monster taken. So what's the impact of this pandemic on South Africa? Now, everybody knows that we were in a bad situation already. Things were really going bad. We were in a technical recession after the first or the last 2 quarters of last year. And this was kind of just the last straw for the South African economy. Government at this stage predicting probably a 10% reduction in the GDP, and that's one of the reasons why we had to open the economy. While the virus was growing, we were opening, and the reason for that was that our projections were showing that we probably have about 46,000 people dying in South Africa of the virus. But if we had a 16% drop in the GDP in South Africa, we would have about 90,000 people dying of hunger in South Africa over the next 3 years. So twice the amount of people dying from poverty. And therefore, we had to play that balancing act and say, let's try and get a good mid-line. So from 1994 to 2008, that first 10, 12 years, we were doing exceptionally well. South Africa were emerging from the previous regime and everything that was going there. Unfortunately, then we have the last decade under President Zuma, everything was going wrong. And unfortunately, the damage to the economy was much more significant than anybody anticipated. And even President Ramaphosa has been battling to date to correct this. We believe, and in January I wrote an article about it, we believe that he is correct in that protecting the rule of law and ensuring that the rule of law is reinstalled in South Africa will eventually result in things improving. But at this stage, it is definitely not good news for South Africa. Inflation is, however, at its lowest level. The Reserve Bank is trying to keep it between 3 and 6. It's currently at 3%, and that's why they were able to reduce the interest rate as much as they could. The big problem in South Africa, unfortunately, is the unemployment number. And the official unemployment number is already above 30%. The official unemployment number in the end of 2019 for the youth is 40.5%, which basically means 1 out of every 2 people under the age of 30 is without a job. If you're without a job, you have no hope. If you have no hope, you have no reason to protect the status quo. Unfortunately, I do not have a lot of time today to talk about our scenario planning and everything, but on the top side of our scenario planning, we've got a new social and economic compact, which would be the best road for us to follow. But there's also the low road, as Clem Santa calls it, which is where we've got social unrest due to the loss of livelihoods. Of course, when it comes to transport, one of the big problems that we have is over the past 10 years, we've seen a constant drop in the investment in the economic infrastructure. And we are seeing the results of that. Many of our construction firms, of course, have already gone into business rescue or have actually closed their doors. But it's not just the amount that of investment that has been decreasing. South Africa is now currently one of the worst when it comes to the quality of the infrastructure that is being built. Now, just interesting again on the transport side, and this is just anecdotal from my own personal experience. I have, over the past 10 years, loved to go on holiday through Botswana, and it was amazing to see the roads that were built by the Chinese in the north of Botswana, and I enjoyed traveling on them about 8 years ago. 2 years ago, when I tried to travel on those same roads, they were non-existent. Most of the people were traveling next to the road because those roads didn't last 10 years. And that is apparently one of the problems that we're having in South Africa as well. Now, we've known for long that unemployment, the previous slide, is probably the biggest problem in South Africa. The second problem would be crime. But if we look at finances, there's 2 big problems in South Africa. The one is our rising public debt. And this year, and it's probably one of the biggest problems with COVID, it is going to shoot the lights out completely. Together with this is the government wage bill. Now, just to put it in perspective, 89% of every 100 Rand the government receives as tax, 89 Rand goes to paying off debt and paying salaries. That means that out of every 100 Rand, there's 11 Rand that's available for everything else. Spending on building schools, spending on building roads, spending on building hospitals. And that is the big problem government face. They need to address the public debt. They need to address the public wage bill. And Minister Tito Mboweni is well aware of this and working quite hard on it. Business South Africa has estimated that the total amount of funding that we are going to require in South Africa over the next 3 years is going to be 3.4 trillion Rand. That's a massive, massive number. So we really have a problem, and that's my biggest concern. If you're asking about transport and stuff, we've got a real big problem in where the money will be coming from for the spend. What is the possible future shocks for the South African economy? Well, this is pandemic light. Just so that you are put into perspective, this COVID-19 is not the big pandemic. This is the first one. We're expecting bigger ones that are much more infectious and where the mortality rate is much higher. And we're concerned about what that will do. As I've already said, we've got the rising debt servicing cost. Everybody was asking for President Ramaphosa the past 2 days for level 2, level 2, level 2. And that's why we got level 2 load shedding from today. There was a little bit of a communication gap on what level 2 we were actually asking for. SOE's bankruptcy is one of the other big risk future shocks that can still hurt us. But again, just to put that in perspective, the total listed property in South Africa is currently so indebted, and there's so much of the property now with Edcon and those companies that is in business rescue that's going to fall open, that the listed property sector in South Africa is in huge crisis. They need 50 billion rand just to get their debt under control, not to pay it off, to get it under control. That is 4 times more than SAA's debt. So it's not just our SOEs that are in trouble. There's a lot of our businesses that are in trouble as well. Of course, one of the other things that we are seeing is that it is now South Africa for South Africa, USA for USA, and we could see that export barriers could be a problem for South Africa going forward. Now we get to where I'm more knowledgeable, taxes. Our tax rate is extremely high in South Africa. Even the SARS Commissioner, Mr. Kieswetter, has recently said he do not see any scope for rate increases. And that, of course, is a problem because we have a significant shortfall in our tax collection for this year. And we will have to see where all of those taxes come from going forward. The growth trajectory for South Africa doesn't look good for the next 4 years. National Treasury, their last projection was minus 7.2% for this year, but it doesn't look that great for the next 3 years. And we're going to need about a 3.5% to 4%, because the only way that we will get out of the problems that we currently have is if we grow out of them. So what is the current social behavioral changes? And I hope that you will probably be able to apply them to your own industry better than I can. But there's a big focus now on personal hygiene. Everybody is much more aware of their health, much more aware of the fact that they could be infected by other people. Social distancing is strong, avoiding crowded places. There's a lot less travel for business and leisure. In PSG, for example, a year ago, I applied that my whole team, because my team is all researchers, could work remotely from home. The company said it is not possible. It will not work if our staff work from home. Within 24 hours from the lockdown, we had 98% of all of our employees working remotely. We are now at a position where we are considering how many of them need to come back. We were able to come back under lockdown level 5 already. It is now lockdown level 3, and we have not returned back to work yet. We have been extremely successful in working from home. The question is, how much of that will remain? Of course, moving to virtual everything. I've had the privilege of looking at all of the artificial intelligence things in one of my meetings for chess in Google head office. And the future is in the artificial intelligence and the virtual reality space is really, really going to change the way we look at things. And then I think what we've also now found is after this, there's a much more conscious consumption. The main thing was crime in 2019. Now there's a lot of corruption. In one of the talks that Professor Tuli Madonsela had in PSG the other day, she said that she is feeling that there's a quiet revolution of uprightness brewing in the country, and she believes it's going to be the saving grace for South Africa. But at this stage, there's a lot of fear, a lot of sadness. Unemployment is becoming quite a problem. I'll address that later on again. And the economy, of course, now the main talking point. As I said, people are much more conscious on what they're spending. We are seeing a drop off on DSTV. One would have thought that everybody is now watching DSTV, but there's a big drop off on DSTV. It's much cheaper to watch Netflix. So much more focus on essential costs, and then prioritizing their luxuries and their beauty and stuff as needed. Holiday and travel, I think, will be the last ones to really get back on track again. So what is the things that I could pick up on transport? As I said, I think Masefto is going to be much better at this than I am. But we, of course, saw an immediate drop, a drastic drop in transport. It is also interesting if you go back later and look at that excess deaths graph that I had up there. It had a massive drop there as well. We had the lowest. We actually had a positive rate at a stage during the lockdown, and because of the fact that nobody was getting drunk and killing themselves and nobody was on our roads. The question, of course, is how long this will take to improve. And I think this slide is probably one of the nicest slides that I could find on this. The question, of course, then is how and for how long will individual attitudes and behaviors change because of COVID-19? Is this a temporary thing? Is it going to be permanent? I think it's going to take another, if COVID-19 is with us for another 6 months, it's going to become permanent. If in the next month things start changing back to normal, it might only be temporary. Of course, together with that, how quickly does automation accelerate, particularly in goods movement? We believe that the online purchasing and everything around that is going to have a big impact. We believe that employers are going to automate much more to protect themselves against the next pandemic. There's going to be a significant change in supply chains. It's been one of the biggest problems. There's been a problem on demand side and the supply side in the supply chain. A lot of demand that's fallen away, but in those areas where demand didn't fall away, the supply was the problem. So we will see a significant change in supply chains going forward. And then the new health measures, how will that impact transportation? I do believe that people are now more afraid of getting COVID than they are afraid of being in an accident. How do government rescue efforts affect the different sectors? How does it affect transport? President Ramaphosa has reiterated on a number of occasions that infrastructure spend is going to be the way that we save this economy. That might be quite beneficial for the public transport. I see that the Gautrain is extremely excited that they might in the next month or two get the go-ahead to start planning the West Rand lines of Gautrain. I'm also excited about that, but I will already be dead and or at least retired before that will become a reality. So the question is, how many trips will be permanently replaced by virtual remote alternatives? I was supposed I would have traveled I started traveling the 1st of February and I would have stopped traveling the 28th of July. I would have had 76 presentations across the whole country. All of them were done. I didn't miss one of them, but none of them were done face-to-face anymore. And the question is, how many of them in the future will be face-to-face again? I think there's going to be a significant change in that regard. And the question then, of course, is how does the public transport cope? We've seen in level 5, there was this 45% drop in transport. They believe that it will not be that big under level 2, and under level 1, it will be significantly less. But of course, the reason why that is that 68% of households in South Africa are forced to use minibus taxis, public transport, and they do not have a choice. Now, this is an interesting graph, and if we looked at the right, this was asking people if they changed their mind about whether to buy a motor vehicle or not. And what interested me was that there was 9% of people that said, you know what, the risk of traveling in public transport is so high that I'm actually considering buying a car now. I never considered it before, but now I am considering buying that car. And that was quite interesting. 12% of people there delaying the purchase of the vehicle, but only 4% of people have now decided not to purchase a vehicle. And that is interesting. So having your own vehicle is now part of protecting yourself against pandemics going forward, and you can work on yourself on what the impact of that would be on travel. Now, there's two main trends, international trends, that I'm not addressing today. I'm focusing more on COVID-19, but there was two other trends that 2 years ago, when I focused on transportation as well for another talk, that I looked at, and the one is automation and the impact of automation. I do not believe that automation is going to work in South Africa very shortly, because if you want to automate, you need to automate all vehicles. You can't have a minibus taxi being driven by a person while all other cars are automated. It's still going to lead to one big accident. And I do not see that the taxi industry will allow automation of transport happening in South Africa. But the other one that could have more of an impact is the sharing economy. I was part of that for very, very long. For the past 7 years, I didn't have a motor vehicle. I had a motorbike. If we needed a motor vehicle, I would rent one from a rental company and give it back after the week or after the weekend. And it would seem that that might be the future. Now, I thought that would result in less vehicles being purchased. I was talking to the sales divisions there. That, however, it would seem would not be the case. Although less vehicles would be on the road, those vehicles would be traveling more, because they will be traveling from the one person using them to the other person using them, and they will be replaced on a much more regular basis. But for transport numbers, they might be much less. We might see more motorcycles on the road. We might also see more cycling and walking for short distances. But as I said, self-protection and hygiene probably now top of mind. Something that we went and looked at is what happened after 9/11. After 9/11, there was a significant drop, and that drop continued for 6 months after 9/11. It didn't have an impact on rail travel or highway travel for very long, but we think that that might be different this time around. There are certain areas in which the travel post 9/11 is still not picked up to the pre-9/11 levels, and that means that we could see negative flight transport for at least the next 5 to 10 years. Coming back again to the question, will it be permanent? Previous crises have showed that in the immediate aftermath of a crisis event, transport behaviors will change. People reassess the cost and the benefits of their different transport modes. The decision making will be partly driven by the people's perception of risk, regardless of whether those perceptions are fact. We always say at PSG, manage the perception, do not manage the fact. We do not think that the impact is going to be that big in South Africa on transport due to COVID, because of the number that I said of people, 68%, that are forced to use public transport because of the spatial development of the previous regime and the impact that that have on how people need to travel in South Africa. As I said, 10 years after 9/11, 24% of Americans were still scared of flying. So what we do believe is that the travel, the manner of travel for the rich will definitely change. Less business travel, less online buying, and those two, I think, will have a significant impact on especially rental companies. Trips, a lot of trips will be substituted by digitization. As I've already said, and much more focus on expanding definition of safety and mobility, not just crashes, but also on how do I protect myself. A growing reliance on e-commerce and home delivery, and we need to look at how that home delivery will impact transport. What needs to be done to optimize the supply chain. That last mile freight movement is going to become much more important. And I've got a few discussion points, not points that I am really going to discuss here today. I think it's things that needs to be considered and need to be looked at. We have aging and outdated infrastructure. There's a lack of private sector and other stakeholder participation. Our systems are a bit uncompetitive. There's definitely no policy certainty. And with all the businesses that has closed down, I do think that there's a significant skill shortage in the civil engineering space in South Africa. We believe that a new social compact will be the future. We will work as PSG in the financial services industry towards achieving this. It's a focus on inclusive growth and job creation, policy certainty for the transport, a lot of development in that space. And as Ms. Seftel will probably focus on, the importance of public transport in South Africa is extremely, extremely important in South Africa. You can go and look at Google Community Mobility Report for South Africa, a very interesting report. It shows how visits and length of stay at different places change compared to a baseline. And you can just go and check. Retail and recreation dropped with 22%. Supermarkets changed with 3%. Public transport in South Africa dropped with 43%. Workplaces dropped with 35%. So just go and check out that mobility report. I'm not going to focus on the minibus taxi challenges. Ms. Seftel will be addressing that, but there is a slide on that in the pack as well. And also some possible solutions that were highlighted by, I think it's the Deloitte report. I've given you some points to consider for transport plans going forward, and hopefully that can create the right debate in your area. One of the reports that I think you can look at is the Deloitte's report, The Futures of Mobility After COVID-19. It is a report that's just come out in the past week. There's also the OECD report out there that can be used on the economic survey in South Africa. I hope I added some value. I had to run through this presentation, but I did think that it was more important for me to create some points to ponder than trying to address all of this.
Ronald, thank you very much. It was not a surprise that you managed to go through your 40-odd slides, and it's really all the detail that you have provided. It's thought-provoking. We need, as you said clearly, we need to think about all of these matters. Ronald, we're going to come back to you, but before I leave you, I just want to provide a bit of a summary of what I am taking out of what you've said, and now it goes there. So you've said the South African economy is in trouble. I've heard back to basics in terms of personal hygiene. We need to do what we need to do. We only need to travel if we have to, because of a fear of contamination. The question that everyone asks in these, when they register is, until when is this going to happen? You mentioned in that slide quite to the end, pop-up infrastructure. I don't think we have the experience, or we don't even know whether there are appropriate regulations to allow us. You referred to e-hailing, and I've read in a week about City of Cape Town who released a new parking policy. You mentioned mobility as a service that you have used for a long time. But also what is important is that if we don't start creating partnerships between business, government, labor, private sector, the build professionals in the industry, we need to stop that thing about they said that and we want this, but we rather need to get to the us. That's what I understood. And then the whole total transport supply chain to be understood. So Ronald, we're going to come back to you just now with a few specific questions that we have collated from the attendees. So we'll come back to you just now. The next speaker, and Ronald, also thank you for your time management. It's fantastic. Thank you. The next speaker, Lisa Seftel, most of you know her extremely well. She is, since February this year, the Executive Director of the National Economic Development and Labour Council. We all know NEDLAC. But I want to highlight a few of these terms in her brief CV: policy development, strategic planning, legislative drafting, capacity building, transport planning, conflict resolution, change management, negotiation, and executing innovative projects in government. Previously, she's been the Executive Director of City of Joburg Transport, and was responsible for the bus rapid transit system. And I believe the minister, the president just called her, and I'm expecting a new announcement that we have a new Minister of Transport. Or what am I talking, Lisa? Can you share your presentation for us? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Frederick, and thank you for inviting me to this forum. What I was saying to Frederick earlier on is that earlier on today, NEDLAC hosted an economic recovery forum, which was chaired by the president. Where I think the issue raised by Advocate King about a social compact going forward was deliberated upon. But actually transport didn't feature much at all, I have to say. So to be honest, I think Advocate King has done a wonderful job, and I think he's used some of my same sources, and so I won't be as long as him, as well as the fact that I think I'm going to be load shed from 4, in which case I'll be able to come back, but I might be disrupted to switch to data. So I haven't focused more generally on the COVID pandemic. I really have focused on the issue of travel behavior. I don't think I have to tell you that full air travel internationally has had a full stop, and virtually for local travel. Interprovincial as well, and I don't think we underestimate the impact of interprovincial and cross-border travel, because so many people do this for funerals, weddings, remittances, and I think it has quite an impact on behavior and our feeling of isolation. No stops. As I think Advocate King said, significant increase in work from home, and a shift back to the car for those who can afford to go back to car. And I think that's, for transport planners who believe in public transport, this must be something very disturbing. And then new stops. I think the Google information shows us more local and walk trips. And the other thing is that there's a lot of trips to malls as a social pastime. And that must happen less, but there's been an increase in trips to provide services at people's homes like hairdressing. And then I also added that there's a new kind of stranded passenger. Even just anecdotally, you know, I meet people who have to use public transport, and the level of anxiety and fear to be able to use it is immense. And instead, together with the economic downturn and the retrenchments, more people are walking longer hours instead of using public transport. The other thing that I think has had a devastating impact on many poor commuters is there's actually no metro rail, or very little metro rail happening at the moment, and I'll return to that. Sorry, I'm trying to move to my next slide. Okay. Yes, and then I think there's a new outlook on vehicle types. Private cars have become a safe space. And actually, because many people have said that if you don't have good connectivity, get into your car and it improves connectivity. So in my many Zoom meetings, I see people sitting in cars. Drive-ins, drive-by weddings, pick-up points outside of restaurants. What I understand about e-hailing is while there's been a decline in passenger use, there's an uptake on deliveries. And I don't know the numbers, but I suspect that there will be a surge in motorbikes, especially for online food and goods deliveries. Bikes is a safer alternative, but still probably not necessarily accessible because of our long distances in South Africa. Minibus taxis and buses to avoid if you can afford, because they're seen as coffins on wheels. And at NEDLAC at the moment, the organized labor has indicated that they want to engage in socioeconomic protest because this 100% is enormously detrimental to workers. And then, you know, as Advocate King said, aeroplanes would be avoided. I think still rich people might fly. There's like a lot of, what you call it, there's a very particular lifestyle, but only if they can afford to pay for space between themselves and the next passenger. I'm also sure, I agree with Advocate King that it'll take a long time for it to fully recover, but the airplanes and to some extent Gautrain have got the amount of money to be able to put in fancier ventilation systems, and these systems are going to come on the market probably more quickly than we realize. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I think these slides are from the B4SA, and I think Advocate King covered very similar ones, so I won't look at them, but I think we just know how COVID has exacerbated challenges. And this is the same slide that Advocate King used. So what does this crisis mean for the transport sector? There is absolutely lockdown and reduced demand for goods and services, and it means reduced travel by workers and consumers. We mustn't underestimate also the reduced demand because of the shift in education, the shift to online learning, as well as significant school and university closures. When I worked for the city, about 1/3 of our passengers related to education. In NEDLAC, we have been working with SABOA, who are very worried about the economic impact on their members. And they say that major bus companies, their fleets are currently operating at about 40% capacity of available bus capacity, and 30% of their fleets are idle. And they think that if you could extend that, it should be that more than 2,200 buses would be currently parked off. And this is because of significant lower demand, up to 40% of what happened previously, while there increased costs. And the increased costs are disproportionately more for some of our public transport than the retail sector because of the number of passengers that pass through. And obviously, there's an important knock-on impact on motor manufacturers, fuel suppliers, finance institutions, as well as informal economies around taxi ranks. So this is from the Google's work, and you can just see the decline in the number of trips that happen as a result of the lockdown, and the extent to which the same number of trips is emerging. for different uses. So then there was a question about what is the COVID pandemic and the decline in demand mean specifically for the minibus taxi industry. And, you know, there's a lot of smoke and daggers here, and smoke and mirrors. There's smoke and daggers and smoke and mirrors. But the NDOT estimate that for commuter travel, taxis break even with the 10th passenger, although this is low for long distance. And taxis usually carry about 15 passengers. So actually, at 70% capacity, they wouldn't get a profit, but they would break even. However, there are a lot of actors in the taxi industry, a lot of middlemen, and a lot of inefficiencies because of their model. And that's why they claim significant losses, and that's why they have been able to make such threatening, be seen as, you know, saying they have no opportunities. And also that their cars would be repossessed and that there would be business failure. I think that, and there has been work done by Business for South Africa, that the losses that they claim would be less as a result of capacity constraints, but more as a result of the significant lower amount of people that are traveling due to retrenchments and less discretionary travel. It's also unknown about who's taking the most strain because of the very peculiar way the taxi, not peculiar, but the very way in which it is structured. It could be that less funds are going to the taxi bosses who control access to routes and so on versus the actual operators and drivers. Because again, in NEDLAC, the community constituency has taxi drivers as part of them. And they say that actually a lower capacity would create more opportunities for spreading jobs of drivers or spreading vehicle use. And that is something that both the organized community and organized labor at NEDLAC have raised with the Minister of Transport. Now, I must say, and I've seen in my time as a ED of Transport, engaged with a lot of ministers and MECs and so on. And I think the fact that this minister, Mbalula, has continued to say that this is not a subsidy, it's an ex gratia payment, and that is conditional on formalization, I think is quite impressive. And particularly, there is argued that the formalization is about tax, and if they're going to get this money, it's going to go through SARS, but also on improved access to unemployment insurance and health and safety, or COID, for taxi drivers. And up to now, the taxi industry is still resisting this. And that is, I think, because the taxi industry can't operate if it's formalized. So personally, I don't believe that this is the moment of formalization. It may be the moment of restructuring, but not necessarily in ways which is good for anybody. It can lead to increased concentration of ownership, and in a sense, then the small guy and the individual operator might lose out, and that would be sad. But I think that informalization, or if you define formalization as a relationship with government, it's endemic, it's systemic within the taxi industry, and we can talk more about that. Then there was another question about what is the impact on the poor and disadvantaged, and I only have one word for it, and it's disastrous. The picture that I've shown here, I'm not sure where it is, but others may know, that was a railway line. And I've seen many such pictures that in the period in which there was a lockdown and no trains were running, and in many areas no trains are running, the entire railway line has been taken away. And I also saw a picture, I wanted to show it, but I couldn't find it again, of Doornfontein Station, which is one of the flagship stations from the World Cup. There were people on the roof taking away the roofing, and somebody was filming it with impunity. So yes, there is an affordability issue. The fares of public transport, private public transport, have been increased. Accessibility with metro rail. And I think the minister puts on a brave face. But there's no point in having very fancy new train sets when the lines is all gone. And safety. There is evidence that public transport is a vector for COVID. I think this thing of saying that the windows must be open is neither here nor, I don't think it happens. And, it's not clear with the science about how safe it is, even with windows open and masks used. And then fear. We're actually dying, to tell the truth. This is one person. We should be 10 passengers because now we see that the coronavirus is here. So there's no good news story here. So what are the lessons for transport planning? So I looked at this much more in terms of, not necessarily, I think Advocate King looked at more broadly. I think there are questions for you who do modeling. There's increased uncertainty of the value of existing models and data. Yes, some of the transport patterns will go back to being similar, but I think with some of the shifts to online and remote working and deliveries and so on, e-commerce, they may not. And with shifts in the property market. And then I think it also means that going forward, one needs to plan also for black swan events like the pandemic, because Advocate King said this may not be the last of such a crisis. The mode shift, I think, is serious. The decline of the shift of the private car, shift to mass service, shift to mobility as a service, I think it's been set back. It doesn't mean to say it won't happen, but it has been set back, as well as the reversal of transit-orientated development trends. Although there may be, but I'm not sure in South Africa, but maybe in other parts of the world, there's more focus on local and so on. I think, if you read internationally, you can see there's been more suburban hubs, but I'm not sure, how it spells out in the South African context. I saw Gordon Lang asked about bikes. I think bikes is a new opportunity, and maybe micromobility, like these fancy, I don't know, 1 and 2, I don't know what you call them, but they're generally called micromobility. But you may also see an increase in tuk-tuks and motorbikes. South Africa to date doesn't look like Kampala or some of the Southeast Indonesia, where you have a motorbike all over the place, and motorbikes also provide a public transport service with all the diesel and dirty, low, high energy problems. That I think is a threat. And then I think the on-street and off-street parking, I think that's more of an opportunity that there's, because less people are using their cars, that you can change your parking space to being a pickup or a drop-off, and that if less people are traveling, that there are possibility for conversions to new uses and less congested spaces. But I've been out of the transport space for a while, so there could very well be other lessons that we can engage on. I think that's my last slide.
Lisa, thank you very much. Quite comprehensive in terms of all the problems that we are facing. You've given some thought and you expressed the matter about the minibus taxis and how they are dealing with the situation. May I just, if I can, just see whether I can share a few notes that I've made as you were speaking concerning the, no, where's my share? There we are. We can share that. Let me go there and share there. And we go there. And then it doesn't want to go to that slide. So I've only travel when you have to, or fear for contamination. I've heard exactly the same with Ronald. I've heard also, again, e-hailing and NMT used to increase. You've used other terminology as well, tuk-tuks and all of those matters. But the biggest problem that I hear is the minibus taxis are not helping the poor. Increased risks and increased fares. So these two things don't go really together. There's this whole debate that is starting to take place, the formalization of the taxi industry, or are we actually now talking about restructuring? Some of those pictures that you've shown about the vandalism of infrastructure, the question is why. You've referred to the station there in south of or north of Soweto. The point really is they need to live. They need to stay somewhere. So whatever is available. In one of these slides, I've seen the whole problem that we are asking, what are we going to use to make or develop our new transport plans, and the uncertainty to plan. I think we need people like yourself to say, well, I'm going to say this is what we are going to do. Somebody who's bold enough to make a decision and take it through. Gordon asked so often the whole matter about NMT and land use interventions. We are all saying, well, shouldn't we start doing it? Shouldn't this be the time to do that? The improvement of the use of street space, specifically for e-hailing, that they can park easier, delivery stuff, things like that. So those are things that I hear, but it's now over to the various transport authorities and the professionals in the industry to apply these and put it into a document. Lisa, thank you very much. You've ably informed us about what is happening. You've suggested a number of matters that you have encountered in your career in Johannesburg for many years that we need to do.